The bodies had red hair, European faces, and woolen clothes stitched in patterns from a continent away, and they were buried in the middle of China, for 1,000 years before anyone from Europe was supposed to have gone anywhere near it. That single fact, sitting quietly in a museum drawer in Urumqi for decades, would eventually force scientists to rewrite an entire chapter of human history. This is the story of the Tarim Basin mummies, and of a discovery so strange that the people who found it didn't fully believe their own eyes. To understand why these bodies caused such an uproar, you have to understand the place they were found. The Taklamakan Desert sits inside the Tarim Basin in far western China, a vast depression ringed by some of the tallest mountain ranges on Earth, the Tian Shan to the north, the Kunlun to the south, the Pamirs to the west. It is one of the most hostile environments on the planet, a place where summer heat can blister skin and winter cold can crack stone. Locals have long said that its name roughly translates to, the place you go in, but don't come out. At its heart lies Lop Nur, a dried lakebed that China later used as a nuclear testing site. Nothing about this landscape suggests preservation. Everything about it suggests erasure. And yet, for nearly 4,000 years, it did the opposite. It kept the dead almost perfectly intact. The reason is chemistry, not embalming. The air in the basin is savagely dry, and the soil beneath it is heavily saline. Together, these two conditions pulled moisture out of buried bodies so thoroughly that soft tissue simply desiccated in place rather than decomposing. Eyelashes survived. Skin texture survived. Strands of hair, still catching the color they carried in life, survived. In effect, the desert mummified its dead by accident, and did it more effectively in some cases than the deliberate embalming practices of ancient Egypt. The first major discovery came in 1980, when Chinese archaeologists working near the ancient city of Lulan, while filming a documentary about the Silk Road, uncovered a woman buried a little more than a meter beneath the sand. She had been wrapped carefully in wool and felt, and when her wrappings were peeled back, her face was still there. Not a skull, but a face, with expression still visible in the set of her features. She became known as the Beauty of Lulan, and radiocarbon analysis eventually dated her burial to roughly 1800 BCE, making her nearly 4,000 years old at the time of her rediscovery. But the more revealing site lay deeper in the desert, at a place called Xiaohe, the small river cemetery, sometimes referred to as Ordex Necropolis after the local hunter who first guided outside visitors there in the early 20th century. Systematic excavation didn't begin in earnest until the early 2000s, and what it revealed was unlike almost any burial ground archaeologists had documented anywhere in Asia. The dead had been placed inside coffins shaped like boats, hollowed from single logs and sealed with cowhide, and above the graves stood dozens of tall wooden poles, some carved into oar-like or phallic shapes whose exact symbolic meaning is still debated. One woman recovered from the site, later called the Beauty of Xiaohe, still wore a white felt hat, a woolen cloak, and boots lined with fur. Tucked against her body were small pouches of ephedra, a plant with stimulant and medicinal properties, placed there deliberately by hands that vanished from the historical record millennia ago. What struck researchers immediately wasn't just the state of preservation. It was the accumulation of bodies that didn't seem to belong where they were found. Hundreds of individuals at Xiaohe alone, many of them tall, with deep-set eyes, high narrow noses, and hair ranging from light brown to a reddish auburn. None of it matched the features associated with the populations who lived in the region in later centuries, and none of it matched what history books said should have been there in the 2nd millennium BCE. Their clothing made the puzzle worse rather than better. These weren't people wearing crude survival gear stitched from whatever hides they could find. They wore finely woven wool, some of it patterned with twill weaves that specialists compared to textile traditions found in Bronze Age Europe. One man was reportedly buried with an entire collection of felt hats. This was a people with a defined sense of style, living in one of the most punishing environments on the planet, and doing it more than 1,000 years before the Silk Road connected the region to organized long-distance trade, and centuries before Han Chinese settlement reached that far west. The scholar most associated with bringing these mummies to international attention is Victor Mayer, a professor of Chinese language and literature at the University of Pennsylvania, who encountered the remains in the 1990s and spent much of his career afterward trying to explain how people with apparently European features ended up buried in the heart of Asia so early. For decades, Every serious theory Mayer and his colleagues proposed shared one basic assumption. These people had come from somewhere else, and the real argument was only over the route. One hypothesis, associated with Mayer and the archaeologist J.P. Mallory, pointed to the Afanasivo culture, a Bronze Age herding society from the Altai region to the north, suggesting that migrants moving south might have carried an early form of Tocharian, an extinct branch of the Indo-European language family later documented in the Tarim Basin. A second theory looked toward the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, a network of oasis civilizations to the southwest, proposing that the Tarim population descended from agricultural settlers who brought irrigation and craft traditions with them. A third pointed to what researchers call the Inner Asian Mountain Corridor, a series of high valleys that could have funneled migrants down from the north and west. 3 theories, 3 different homelands, but every single one assumed an outside origin. Genetic testing in the 1990s and 2000s only deepened the confusion rather than resolving it. Early samples, some reportedly analyzed outside China, were said to suggest links to Western Eurasian ancestry. Later, a team led by geneticist Li Jin at Fudan University reported a more complicated mixture, one that included East Asian and even South Asian genetic markers among the remains. That finding was contested by other researchers, including Mayer, and the picture remained unresolved. Compounding the difficulty, the mummies had become politically sensitive. To some Uyghur communities in the region, these ancient remains were regarded as ancestral evidence of a deep historical claim to the land, predating other later populations. Chinese authorities grew increasingly cautious about that framing, and access for foreign researchers tightened considerably in the years that followed, making comprehensive genetic study difficult for a long stretch of the early 21st century. That changed in October 2021, when a team led by geneticist Fan Zhang published a landmark study in the journal Nature on the genomic origins of the Bronze Age Tarim Basin mummies. The project brought together an international group of researchers, including Christina Warinner, an anthropologist affiliated with Harvard University and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, along with geneticist Chuanchao Wang, who had spent years working on the population history of the region. For the first time, scientists were able to sequence genome-wide data directly from the earliest known individuals buried in the basin, 13 people in total, 11 of them from the Xiaohe cemetery itself, along with several more from the neighboring Zhangarian basin to the north, all dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE. These were not later arrivals. They were among the founding population of the entire region, the very people every migration theory had been built to explain. The logic behind the study was straightforward. If these individuals had truly migrated from the Afanasivo steppe, or from Central Asian oasis cultures, or along the mountain corridor, their DNA should carry a clear genetic signature linking them to one of those source populations. Migration leaves a trace. Find the trace, and you find the road these people traveled. What the researchers found instead was that there was no road at all. The genome showed no detectable connection to Afanasivo steppe populations, and no significant signal from Central Asian farming communities either. Instead, the Tarim founders turned out to be an unusually isolated local population, descended from groups that had already been living in and around the region since the early Holocene, thousands of years before the first grave at Xiaohe was ever dug. Their ancestry broke down to roughly 72% from a lineage geneticists call Ancient North Eurasian, with the remaining portion tracing to an ancient Northeast Asian source. In other words, every competing theory had proposed a different distant homeland, and the DNA answered that none of them applied. These people had not arrived from anywhere. They had simply always been there. That answer only deepened the mystery of the second kind, though, because it left the question of the faces completely unresolved. If they weren't migrants from Europe or Central Asia, why did their features look so distinctly non-local? The answer runs back to a population that had nearly vanished entirely from the genetic record. The Ancient North Eurasians, a group of Ice Age hunter-gatherers who once ranged across the Siberian interior before the retreat of the glaciers scattered their descendants and effectively erased them from most of the regions they once occupied. For a long time, geneticists knew this population had to have existed because its genetic fingerprint kept turning up as an unexplained component in other populations, but no one had a direct sample of the people themselves. That changed with a discovery near Lake Baikal in Siberia, at a site called Malta, where the remains of a young boy who died roughly 24,000 years ago had been excavated back in the 1920s. It wasn't until a team led by geneticist Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen sequenced his genome decades later that scientists confirmed his ancestry belonged to precisely this long-suspected Ice Age lineage. That child, known in the scientific literature as MA1, gave the ancient North Eurasians their first confirmed genetic face. The strange part is how widely this vanished population's DNA still travels today, even though almost no group anywhere carries it as a majority ancestry. Some estimates suggest ancient North Eurasian ancestry accounts for somewhere between roughly 14 and 38% of Native American genetic heritage, and a smaller but still meaningful share of ancestry among many European populations. A lineage that essentially disappeared as a distinct group left fragments of itself scattered across two continents whose populations never directly mixed with one another. And remarkably, the Tarim Basin mummies turned out to be among the most complete, best-preserved direct representatives of that same vanished lineage found anywhere on Earth, held intact in the salt and sand of the Taklamakan long after the broader population had faded out almost everywhere else. There is a second layer to this story that is, in some ways, even more unusual than the genetics. Despite their genetic isolation, the Tarim people were not culturally closed off at all. Chemical analysis of dental plaque from the mummies revealed traces of dairy proteins, showing that these people were herding animals and consuming milk products from very early on. Their diet, reconstructed through further analysis, combined wheat and dairy traditions that trace back toward Western Asia, millet cultivated in East Asia, and ephedra likely sourced from Central Asian trade networks. In short, they were absorbing agricultural knowledge, food crops, and medicinal plants from every direction the compass could offer, while somehow marrying almost exclusively within their own small, isolated community. It's a genuinely unusual pattern in the archaeological record, a population open enough to adopt technologies and foodstuffs from across the breadth of Eurasia, yet closed enough that none of the people who brought those goods and ideas to them ever became part of their bloodline. Even with this level of genetic clarity, plenty remains unresolved, and it's worth being honest about the limits of what the evidence can tell us. Whether the Tarim founders actually spoke an early form of Tocharian remains a matter of debate among linguists rather than geneticists, since language leaves no trace in bone or blood. The linguist Elizabeth Wayland Barber has cautioned against assuming a direct link, pointing out that roughly 1,000 years separate the mummies from the earliest written Tocharian texts discovered in the region, plenty of time for a language to spread through cultural contact without any accompanying population movement. Other scholars, including linguist Ronald Kim, have argued the timeline could still support continuity between the two. Neither position has been conclusively settled, and it likely won't be by genetics alone. There is also the matter of scope. The 2021 study, groundbreaking as it was, examined only 13 individuals from essentially one horizon at one pair of sites. Geneticist Vagheesh Narasimhan has noted that broader sampling across additional locations and time periods in the Tarim Basin could still complicate or refine the picture that these initial genomes suggested. And the political sensitivity surrounding the region continues to limit how much additional research foreign scientists can conduct there, meaning a considerable amount of what these remains could still reveal likely remains locked away, both by the desert itself and by the circumstances surrounding access to it. What the 2021 study did settle, with a level of certainty no prior theory had achieved, is where these people came from. They were not wandering herders from the steppe, nor migrant farmers from a Central Asian oasis, nor travelers funneled down some mountain corridor from a distant homeland. They were, instead, the descendants of a nearly vanished Ice Age population that had quietly held its ground in one of the harshest environments on the planet for thousands of years, absorbing trade goods, foodstuffs, and ideas from every surrounding culture while remaining genetically apart from all of them. For a century, they were treated as strangers who had wandered into a place they didn't belong. Their own DNA told a different story. They were not the newcomers at all. They were among the last surviving fragments of a world that had already ended everywhere else, preserved by accident in salt and sand, waiting patiently in the dark until someone finally learned how to read what they had left behind.